burning fat does not equal losing fat from the body.
Correct.
And then burning fat has to be divided into burning of body fat stores, and we need to distinguish that from burning of dietary fat that is brought in.
Correct.
Oftentimes people don't disambiguate those.
Correct.
Right? And I'm also understanding that reducing one's body carbohydrate stores, muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, et cetera, occurs during high intensity exercise.
Yep.
As well as other ways, but that is one very efficient way to tap into those stores, which makes me wonder, again, this is one of these things that does it lead to a protocol, makes me wonder whether or not doing high intensity, let's say weight training for 45 to 60 minutes, 75 minutes of strength training, power training, hypertrophy training, which we've covered in an episode about those topics, and then doing some steady state cardiovascular exercise. Is there any benefit to that arrangement that would, quote unquote, enhance body fat loss from the body, to be very specific now? Because unlike the idea that training fasted would shift the bias towards fat loss, which it doesn't, you've told us, under those conditions, muscle glycogen and maybe even liver glycogen is going to be depleted. Put simply, can I enhance body fat loss by doing some cardio after a bout of weight training?
If you equate for total energy expenditure, it won't matter. Now, you did bring up a very important point that I want to clarify. If you look at the exercise modalities that we laid out in our previous conversations, we talked about 9 different adaptations. One was skill, and then speed, power, strength, hypertrophy, muscular endurance, anaerobic capacity, aerobic capacity, and long duration endurance. Now, speed, power, and skill development have almost no benefit for fat loss. Because remember, those are low weight, a lot of rest, and low volume. They're not really going to be helpful. You can make a little bit of a case for strength, a little bit, but the total energy expenditure for strength training, even if it's an hour, if it's truly strength training, it's fairly low.
Because the repetitions are in the 1 to 3 range.
That's exactly. It's not enough for total work. So if you're trying to develop a protocol that sort of optimizes fat loss, what you want to do, you were close. In my opinion, is do a combination of something in the hypertrophy / muscular endurance strength training realm.
Okay, so 6 to 30 repetitions.
Something like
of
that.
Resistance training.
Great.
Deplete muscle glycogen, maybe even a bit of liver glycogen.
Maybe a little bit, depending on if you're doing it for a long time, but probably not a noticeable amount.
Okay, so an hour of hypertrophy type training.
If you're training hard with low rest intervals and you really did an hour, you would for sure get there. But most people don't.
Is that the reason why I crave large bowls of oatmeal and rice after I do weight training?
Yeah,
I want to replenish muscle glycogen.
Totally, right? Then you maybe do a little bit of very high intensity, maximum heart rate, well over VO2 max, hard as you can for 20, 30, 45, 60 seconds, something like that, with some recovery, a lot of recovery, and repeated. And that's going to do a great job of deplenishing muscle glycogen, right? If you do that long enough, you'll get the liver, but again, most people don't because it's really, really hard to go that hard.
So liver is sort of last resort.
Yeah, basic mechanics here, which we'll actually get into as our like third segment here, is energy production comes from the local exercising muscle first and foremost from phosphocreatine and carbohydrate stores, right? And so again, and we store it in a muscle, we call it glycogen, right? It's your first line of defense. If you need glucose outside of that, you're going to start pulling it from the blood. But one of the things, your body regulates a handful of things over almost everything: blood pH, blood glucose, blood pressure, and electrolyte concentrations. Like, it really does not want to mess with those things at all. It will change almost anything else in the body to keep those things standardized, right? You generally, because you need all those things for your brain to work, and your brain will stop working, right? If you lose blood pressure, it won't go up there. pH changes, you can't run metabolism. Electrolytes change, you can't think. And glucose is a primary fuel source for the brain. It's going to be a problem, right? So if that number starts to come down because you're grabbing glucose out of the blood, your liver is going to then kick in. It's going to break down its glycogen to put glucose into the blood to keep the blood number the level. In fact, one of the things you'll see is blood glucose concentrations rise during exercise. They don't fall. In fact, they rise as an anticipatory state. If you train a lot, your blood glucose will start going up before you start moving. It knows it's coming, right? So you can play that game. You can rob Peter to pay Paul for a long time until your liver runs out. And that's what actually is a bonk. And in terms of like long duration endurance stuff, you're talking many miles, several hours. Typically we say, oh, it's got to be over 2 hours before your liver starts to become a real problem, or it has to be tremendously intense because of those reasons. You have to burn through just a lot of energy before your liver starts to get into a problem. You can continue to train when your muscle glycogen levels are low. In fact, people say glycogen depletion in muscle, but it's generally a misnomer. And you are going to have tremendous signals of fatigue when that number gets lower than 75%. So people think that like their muscles are getting heavy. You're probably still 75% full. A lot of folks will quit around the 50%. The highest I've ever seen is like 95% true depletion. And that's in extremely high level cross-country skiers and like their deltoid. It gets very, very low. Some very talented runners will get fairly low in their quads. But the vast majority of folks, by the time you're 50% depleted, you're going to quit. It's going to be really, really challenging. So you're never really going to get that low. It's like a bit of a protective mechanism, right? But when your liver gets low, you're going to be shut down. And that's the case of if you've ever been to like a marathon and you've seen people run like 25.5 miles and then they just like bonk, they go into like baby deer walking stance and then they collapse. And you're like, how are you mentally weak? Like you ran 26 miles and you can't run the last point. It ain't mentally weak. It is, if your liver is done, it's going to stop you because there's no more backup reserves. Muscle you can get away with, you can push through it. Liver will not let you go any farther.
I find this fascinating because it makes me wonder whether or not the liver being depleted sends a neural signal to the brain.
Oh, absolutely.
Or the brain must register some signal like, I would like to be alive tomorrow. Thank you. Whatever is happening right now, stopping is going to be safer than continuing.
Yeah.
And so that stop signal is one that I think a lot of people, including myself, are intrigued by because we always think that it's related to willpower. Mm-hmm. But the brain needs to preserve itself. And as the master computer, I mean, there are ways to go into kind of automaton type, not thinking, just doing type behavior.
You have override switches, right? And you can play those cards and you can get better at learning and being less sensitive to that switch. That's exactly what happens when you first start training, right? You start to realize like, oh my gosh, I'm super tired. And then you realize really quickly like, oh, I'm totally fine here. And this is like the pick your person who's made sayings like this, but it's like you're really only 10% depleted or 30% or 40% or some
We're
number.
all operating at 40% of what we could do.
Of course. Right. Any of those things are true because it is like a little bit of an override. You've just gotten very sensitive to being a small percentage depleted and you've learned, okay, I'm tired. And there is a long way to go past that. But once you get past that and you flip that override switch a lot, you're going to break quickly because you basically learned to ignore that signal and problems can happen really quickly after that. And that's even experienced endurance athletes. If you hit that level, it's like you're going to be hitting the concrete next. And that's potentially a problem.